Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Azumullah ujurana wa ujurakum bi basabina bil Hussein alayhi salam. In this series, we are exploring the life and the legacy of one of the most prominent figures in the movement of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam. That is to say, Hazrat Zaynab alayhi salam, the woman who is renowned for being the voice of Karbala, for bringing the message of the Imam alayhi salam to the world. The night after Ashura was a night of tremendous difficulty. Indeed, this night would be more painful for the Imams who would come than the actual events on the day of Ashura. Al-Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam would remember this night with tears in his eyes. And Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, throughout his life, his eyes would fill with tears. And people would ask him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, why are you crying? And he would say, I am remembering that night, the night after my father was killed, the night after my father was slaughtered. And I saw the women running from tent to tent, the children running, the enemy everywhere. The enemies were attacking the camp. And all that time, a caller was calling out, "Ahriqu buyut al-zalimin," burn the tents and the homes, the dwellings of these tyrants. And what painful words to hear after you have given so much in the way of Allah Ta'ala, and you are guilty of no sin. And this was a tremendously difficult time, in particular for Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her. She not only had to bear her own loss, she had lost virtually all of her family, almost all of her family in one day. She had lost her children, she had lost her brothers, she had lost her other relatives. And not only lost them, but lost them in a very brutal way, in a very malicious way. The women and children around her were also suffering from tremendous grief. They had lost their sons, they had lost their husbands, they had lost their family. And many of them didn't know what was going to happen. They were scared. There were literally tens of thousands of enemy soldiers all around them. And as soon as the Imam had fallen, there was no one else to carry a weapon. There was no one else to stand against them. And thus the enemies rushed towards them. They began to steal whatever small amount of property that they had. They even began to take things from the corpses. And then they began to burn down the tents one by one as the women rushed from tent to tent seeking shelter from the enemies, not knowing where to go. Some of the women and the children got lost, and Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, had to go find them. She was going here and there, still suffering from the thirst too, suffering so much pain, emotional pain, physical pain. It was indeed a very difficult time for her in the beginning of a very difficult journey. And yet we see on this night how Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha was able to fulfill the mission that the Imam had given her, the mission to protect the survivors and to protect the Imamate as well. And some people might ask, how is it that she could do this? She was literally standing before an army of 50, 60,000 at least. How was it that Sayyida Zaynab could defend the camp from this enemy? What weapons did she have? We see what kind of weapons she used when she had to defend the life of Al-Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. Because we know that when some of the enemies learned that Ali ibn al-Hussein, Al-Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, was still alive, they said, we have been ordered to kill all of the sons of al-Hussein alayhi salam. They said, we cannot leave any children of the Prophet alive. We're not going to leave any of the lineage of the Prophet alive. And so Shimr al-Ain went to kill him. And this is even when some of the enemies themselves were disagreeing. Some of them were saying, yes, we have to kill him. And some of them were saying, no, maybe we can let him live. He's just a young man. He's ill. He's no threat. But Shimr was insistent on doing it. And so there was no one else to protect the Imam but Zaynab, peace be upon her. She goes in front of the Imam. she blocks him, and she says that if you want to kill him, you're going to have to kill me first. Shimr, he might have done that. He didn't have any hesitation to do such a thing. But this shamed some of the people. Some of them, they felt shy just to kill a woman like that in cold blood. And so they backed off. They said, just leave him for now. We can just take him as a captive, as a prisoner, like everyone else. And thus we see that one of the main weapons that Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha had, a weapon that you and I also have too, was her words. She did not have a sword, she did not have a bow and arrow, she did not have a spear, but she did have her words. And indeed, we do have many narrations which say that words can be more effective than physical fighting. Words can be more powerful than carrying a sword. And we see that on the night after Ashura, it was her words that saved the life of the Imam. When they arrived in Kufa, it was her words that literally inspired a revolution among the people. When they arrived in Sham, it was her words that broke the foundations of Yazid's rule. It was the words of Sayyida Zaynab alayhi salam that would be able to keep the mission of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam alive. And this is something which is of paramount importance for us today, because many of us today are not actually on the battlefield. Now, some of us are, some of us do go out and fight, but many of us are not carrying weapons to try to fight against the world's problems, to physically fight for justice, to fight for truth, to fight for what we know is right. However, many of us do fight with words, even more so nowadays because there is so much more opportunity for our words to be spread. We have the internet, we have social networking, we have satellite television, and so our words can have a profound impact. And so therefore, this is one aspect of the legacy of Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha that you and I, that all of us can fulfill. And in fact, there is a tremendous need for us to fill. Because just as Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha had to fight against the propaganda and the lies of the Umayyad Caliphate in her own time, we too have to fight against many lies and untruths, misconceptions spread by the mass media in many countries. And so this is definitely something that we can and should emulate from her. Her words, however, were not all that she had. She had something else that was very powerful, and it is a trait of the mu'min, it is a trait of the believer. Indeed, maybe you can say it's a gift from Allah Ta'ala to the believer, and that is she had a very strong presence, what we call the haiba of the mu'min, the ability to inspire awe that a true mu'min has, a true believer has, because they are so connected to Allah Ta'ala, because they're so close to Allah Ta'ala, that they do inspire this sense of awe and sense of respect in people around them. And we see this on that night when they were hesitant to kill her. We see this in Kufa. It's related that when they arrived in Kufa, Hazrat Zaynab, peace be upon her, all she did was gesture, just one gesture, and everyone fell silent, completely silent. They were motionless. The metaphor that's used is as if there was a bird on top of their heads. And not only that, but it's narrated that even the animals stopped moving around. They had bells on their necks and they stopped ringing. And this is something that, again, is given to all of the believers, if they are true believers, inshallah, sincere believers in Allah Ta'ala, because of the deep connection of the believer with Allah Ta'ala. And it was another thing that Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha had on that journey. She had her words and she had her presence. And of course, we cannot forget one of the most important things that Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha had. One of the most powerful things, sometimes one of the things we forget when we get very busy in this material life. We think about how we're going to stand up for certain things, how we're going to accomplish certain goals. She had her words, she had her presence, but also she had her faith. She had her taqwa. She had her consciousness of Allah Ta'ala. She had her reliance on Allah Ta'ala. And that was what gave her strength. That was what gave her inspiration. That was what enabled her to be literally a shining light in these darkest of times, in these times when the people around them were afraid, maybe they had lost hope, They were in pain, they were suffering, she was suffering too. But nonetheless, her faith was only strengthened by the calamities that they endured, by the suffering that they endured. And we see this in so many ways with respect to what happened on Ashura and afterwards. We know that when she placed her hands beneath the body of the Imam, which was now lifeless, what did she say? Despite all of her grief, she says to Allah, Ilahi, taqabbal hadha al-qurban. Oh Allah, accept from us this sacrifice. This is for you, O Allah. We understand that we are from you, and to you we return. This is the way of the world. This is our role in the world. And this is what we would like to do, to give everything for your sake. This was from her faith. Many people would not do that, but this was her faith that inspired her to do that. We also know that on the night after Ashura, after the situation had calmed down, after the enemies had retreated, after the fires had gone out, after the women and children had been able to drink water, even though that was so difficult for them to do, knowing their loved ones had died thirsty. It said that despite all of the difficulties she was going through, Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha herself took the time to commune with her Lord and to say Salat al-Layl, to say the night prayers. Although it's related that she was so weak at that time, she was unable to do so standing up. She had to sitting down. But this was indeed the way of the household of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. She had seen her father praying like this all the time. She had seen her mother staying up all night praying for others too, not even praying for herself, saying first to the neighbors, then ourselves. And so it is no surprise that Sayyida Zaynab salamullahi alayha would continue this tradition, no matter how dire the circumstances around them, and use this time to praise and thank her Lord. And we see this also reflected in her speeches, that despite the fact that some of her speeches are very harsh, they are very severe. When she speaks to the people of Kufa, her words are very severe. When she speaks to Yazid, her words are very severe. Nonetheless, she began and ended her speeches with sincere praise of Allah Ta'ala, sincerely thanking Him for His mercy, for His compassion, for His generosity, for the gifts He had bestowed upon them. And that is an example of true faith. And in the subsequent episodes, we will explore how Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, what other ways Sayyida Zaynab, peace be upon her, was able to stand against the enemy, in addition to her words, her presence, and her faith. وآخر دعوانا عن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.